What are we discussing on today's Locked on Diamondbacks podcast? One thing that went right for each D-backs position player this past season. And then, of course, wrapping the pod with another player review. Today, it's Kevin Newman edition.
You are Locked on Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. You're listening to who? The always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas, multimedia journalist and graphic designer. So please go check out my website, millardthomas24.myportfolio.com. On there you can see all my latest work, from my packages to my articles to my photos and my graphic design. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to win $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. On today's Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, I want to discuss one thing each D-backs position player, the starters at least, one thing that each one of them did right this past season. And then we're going to wrap the pod with another player review. And today we're going to discuss Kevin Newman. So thank you to everyone for making Locked on Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners, sharing, subscribing, reviewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free. It's available on all platforms. So please continue to tell your friends. And one of those platforms is YouTube. Please hit subscribe to Locked on Diamondbacks on YouTube. Now let's get into the show and let's discuss what went right for each D-backs position player this past season. And I only want to discuss the starters among the position players. And we're just going to give one quick headline that went right for each D-back starter. We're going to start with the little Gabriel Moreno. And for him, the thing that really stood out to me from his past season was the fact that he destroyed he destroyed pitching when he was hitting second in the D-backs lineup. For some reason, when Gabriel Moreno batted second this past year, 415 average, a 1075 OPS, and we really started to see him take off offensively when Torey Lovullo decided to move him up in the lineup against left-handed pitching. He seemed so comfortable in that spot. When you went Marte as your leadoff, Moreno is your number 2 hitter, Gurriel's your 3, Walker's your 4. Carroll, I guess, was like batting 6th and 7th a lot of times in those lineups, but Moreno looked so good as the number 3 hitter, and I still think Carroll has to be the top 3 in your lineup, no matter if there's a righty or a lefty on the mound. But going to next season, maybe we do look at Moreno as your number 2 starter when there's a lefty on the mound. Maybe you go Carroll, lead off, Marte, number 3 hitter. Maybe Gurriel bumps down to like number 5 or something like that, because the way Moreno swung the bat this past season when he batted second, I think we need to see a larger sample size of it. Because for some reason, 209 average, 610 OPS when batting 8th, 234 average, 690 OPS when batting 7th, 220 average, 578 OPS when batting 6th. And those are between 17 and 30 game sample sizes, whether he's batting 6th, 7th, or 8th. He's below average in those positions. But for some reason this past year, 16 games, when he batted second, he destroyed pitching this past season. So I want to see another year of Moreno batting second for the D-backs next year. Doesn't have to be every single day, but at least the days when there's a lefty on the mound, let's see Gabriel Moreno a little bit higher in the lineup. Next up, Christian Walker. The one thing that he really did well this past season that I want to highlight, he was the Dodgers killer, something that we've talked about a ton on this podcast. He murdered the Dodgers in 9 games this season for Arizona. 34 at-bats, 9 home runs, 15 RBIs. He had more RBIs than hits, a 412 average. He had 7 walks to 6 strikeouts, and a 1765 OPS. He had 43 total bases and 42 plate appearances. He was insane this year against the Dodgers, and he really played well when he was at Dodger Stadium. In 6 games at Dodger Stadium, he had 7 home runs, 11 ribbies, and an 1877 OPS. Christian Walker, a pending free agent, We cannot let him leave this offseason, and we can definitely not let him leave to a team like the Dodgers. Now, they do have Freddie Freeman, so it might be a little bit tougher for Christian Walker to sign with the LA Dodgers, but Freddie Freeman, he's showing some signs of being hurt already this past postseason. Maybe his body's starting to be in the decline. Like Freddie Freeman's still a great bat, but maybe you want to move Freddie Freeman to that DH role. Christian Walker now comes in to be your first baseman. The Dodgers can do something like that if they want to. After seeing the numbers that Christian Walker has put up this past season and in his career against LA, I don't think Walker's going to LA or anything like that. I don't want to let that speculation run wild. It would just be insane to see, but he needs to stay with Arizona because he is a Dodgers killer, and he did it again, once again this season. How about this one? Ketel Marte. The one thing I want to highlight from his 2024 season, the hard contact stats. This guy was one of the best players in the league in terms of the ball flying off his bat. 98th percentile in average exit velocity, 96th percentile in expected slugging percentage, 96th percentile in hard hit percentage. This guy crushed it all season long in terms of the ball just flying off of Ketel Marte's bat. And really, whenever that ball was a fastball, exit velocity average of 95 mile per hour average exit velocity for Marte against the fastball. He crushed that pitch this season. 632 slugging against it. If you threw a fastball against Marte, he crushed it. And really against every sort of pitch, he kind of crushed, if you're being honest. I mean, he still had a 581 slugging against breaking pitches as well. So he was really crushing every type of pitch. Off-speed pitch, average exit velocity of 90.5 miles per hour as well. So when looking at his past season, the one thing I want to highlight, the hard contact stats were insane for Ketel Marte. Next up, Geraldo Perdomo. The thing I want to highlight for him, he has elite play discipline. We always talk about it, but when you actually see the numbers, it really lays it out for you because 90th percentile in K rate, 96th percentile in chase percentage, and 99th percentile in whiff percentage. This is a guy who does not swing at strikes outside the zone. It's a guy who does not chase pitches. It's a guy who does not strike out a ton overall. If anything, Geraldo Perdomo is going to put the ball in play, and you have to respect him for it. Geraldo Perdomo is a really good baseball player, and I think I've even underrated him at times, but no longer. I finally respect and value Geraldo Perdomo, and that's why I believe the D-backs want to. You could trade Jordan Lawler and just go with Perdomo as the shortstop of the future. And so love his play discipline from this past season. And the last thing I want to talk about, Eugenio Suarez. I'm sure there's a couple directions you could have gone here. You could have said power, you could have said defense, but I'm going to go with the easy cop out answer and say the thing I want to highlight is his second half of the year, which is something we've highlighted so many times on this podcast. But once again, really just split his season in half. First 81, second 81. Truly two different players where he was a top 3 worst player, first 81 games, top 3 best player, the second 81 games, where some of the numbers are telling you he's doing stuff that we haven't seen since Babe Ruth. And so for Eugenio Suarez, the power was so important for what he was able to provide with the home runs this past season, his defense this past season as well. But I think for the most part, the thing that he really brought to the D-backs that helped was his second half of the season, because he was not a guy who was doing something consistent from game 1 to game 2. He was truly a guy where you have to say, throw out the first 80 games of the season because the second 80 games is an entirely different player. It's the guy that we saw in the second half of the season that helped this D-backs team almost make the postseason. Now we'll talk about the rest of the D-backs position players. And the one thing that I want to highlight that they did right this past season in 2024. But hey, I want to talk to my guys for a second because guys, sometimes intimate moments happen spontaneously, and we always want to be ready so we can perform in the bedroom. Hims provides access to treatments that can help you stay hard and last longer, giving you that boost of confidence so you can be ready whenever the mood strikes. Hims is changing men's healthcare by providing you with access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. The process is 100% online, so there's no need for uncomfortable doctor's visits. No insurance is needed, and one low price covers everything from treatments to ongoing care. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/lockedon. That's hims.com/lockedon for your personalized ED treatment. Hims.com/lockedon. The product mentions are chewable compound products, which are not approved by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for details on important safety information. Subscription required. Price varies based on product and subscription plan. All right. Let's get back to the Lockdown Dimebacks podcast. Let's discuss a couple of more players who did one thing right that I really want to highlight from this past season. Of course, all these players did multiple things right, but there is one thing each one of them did that I think really stood out from their past season. And for the next guy, Lords Gurriel, it's kind of similar to what we just talked about with Christian Walker, but it's actually a little bit more broad. Lord Gurriel is just the NL West killer. You look at his numbers against every NL West team, and he kind of murders them all, which is really important to see because those are definitely the most intense, most frustrating series. And the fact that Gurriel steps up in those moments in those series is really helpful. Now he's not good against the Dodgers. Maybe that's the one caveat I should say, but against the Rockies this past season, 371 average, 1135 OPS. Against the Giants, 382 average, 946 OPS. Against the Padres, 317 average, 902 OPS. I guess we could hope that he gets better against the Dodgers, but at least three of the other four teams in the division, Gurriel is going to look like a superstar against them. And the Padres, the Giants, the Rockies, those division games are so frustrating. I mean, it's the reason the D-backs missed the postseason because we didn't do enough against teams like the Rockies and the Padres down the stretch of the season. And maybe we could have used a little bit more Lords Gurriel playing time or something. Maybe we could have used another at bat or two from Lords Gurriel because he's so good against those NL West opponents. Unfortunately, we did not get it, but I truly believe Lords Gurriel is going to have a nice, solid bounce back and look closer to the dude that we saw in 2023 than the guy that we saw this past year, where I think we saw a little bit dip in power for Gurriel. I think his numbers are going to go up a little bit more next year. Next up, Corbin Carroll. The biggest thing for me that stood out from his 2024 season, once again, triple galore for Carroll. I think it's the easiest thing when you look at his last 2 years. He has led the league in triples. He had a down season by his standards, a 230 average, a 749 OPS. But if you want to be positive about Corbin Carroll, you can do just the same Eugenio Suarez treatment where you just split his season right down the middle because this was a completely different player in the second half of the year. And in his last 64 games, Corbin Carroll had a 919 OPS. And I think going to next year, you definitely have to watch out for Corbin Carroll from a power perspective because he might have rediscovered his power swing in the second half of this past season. And that's going to be the thing that I watch out the most for with Corbin Carroll entering 2025 is that power back because he hit 17 home runs those last 64 games, led the league in triples once again. Like the power was still kind of there for Corbin Carroll, and he really put on a big display those last 80 games of the year. So we need to see if he could do it again next year. And once again, the triples always feels like they're going to be there for Corbin Carroll because he had 10 in 2023, 14 this past season. And why won't he lead the league in triples once again next year? How about this? Jock Peterson. And for him, the thing that I want to highlight is something that we signed him for this past season, being a righty killer, because that's exactly what lefty Jock Peterson did. He murdered right-handed pitching, which is something that we all wanted him to do. A 281 average, a 923 OPS against righties, 22 home runs in 129 games. Like, that's exactly what we wanted from you, Jock. Nothing more, nothing less. Go out there, play DH, hit some bombs, and crush righties. Hit some clutch hits at the, bottom of the ninth, bottom of the eighth, late game situations, get some big clutch hits, which is also something Jock Peterson did all year. He was super clutch for the D-backs this past season. That's the other thing you could have highlighted if you want to. his clutchness, because that was something that was a major part of his game this past year. But the thing I'm going to highlight is his numbers against right-handed pitching, because that was the reason the D-backs signed him, and he lived up to the billing of being a righty killer. Randall Grichuk, the thing I want to highlight is the opposite of Jock Peterson. He was a lefty killer, which is the reason why the D-backs signed him. As a right-handed bat, Grichuk was going to be the other half of the platoon situation to the DH for Jock Peterson, and they have been absolutely perfect. Randall Grichuk, 319 average and a 914 OPS against left-handed pitching this past year. He was pretty solid against righties too, over 800 OPS, but against lefties, looked like an all-star. Really, really special from that side of the plate, which makes sense because he has always been very good against lefties in his career. And he just did it one more time for the D-backs this past season, where I wish we could have got him more playing time, because, like I said, he was even decent against right-handed pitching. And that's why it's so frustrating to see that we just are so overly committed to platoon situations at times, because guys like Randall Grichuk were good against both righties and lefties this past season. But he was signed to be a lefty killer, and that's what he was this past season, a lefty killer. So we needed to highlight that. Then the final guy that we're going to discuss among the position players who started at least 100 games for the D-backs this past season is Jake McCarthy. And the thing that I want to point out from his season this past year is his contact ability, because we knew he got better against left-handed pitching. That was going to be the only way he stayed in the lineup, and he did just that. When you look at the contact percentage for Jake McCarthy the last 3 years, it has actually gotten better every single year. 72% in 2022, 77% in 2023, and now 82% in 2024. It's not surprising to see Jake McCarthy always seem to have his barrel near the ball, always seems to be right near the sweet spot. Jake McCarthy, I think, just overall really good approach to the plate, and I think he made major strides in his swing and his just overall approach at the plate. And so I think Jake McCarthy is definitely a guy, again, to watch out for. He's an underrated part of this D-backs piece. Still a guy who kind of flies under the radar. Jake McCarthy is either going to be a guy that helps out the D-backs a lot next year as, again, a number 4 outfielder, or as a potential trade piece this offseason if the D-backs want to get kind of crazy. But either way, we all love Jake the Rake and very excited and hope he comes back to the D-backs in 2025. Now we're going to discuss one player who might not be back on the D-backs in 2025 as we do his player review, Kevin Newman, in segment number 3. But if you're into daily fantasy sports, then I suggest going on Prize Picks, because Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 player stats for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your games all season long on Prize Picks. You can sign up today and get $50 instantly when you put your first $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's Prize Picks. Prize Picks. Run your game. All right. Let's get back to the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Let's discuss Kevin Newman. Let's do his little player review and how he performed for the D-backs in 2024, because as we're doing every day on this podcast for the rest of the offseason until I run out of players that I want to talk about, we are going to end the pod with a player review on how they played this past season and then setting up goals for them in 2025. And for Kevin Newman, this was someone that, honestly, the numbers may not have been that impressive when you look at the final season slash line of 270 average, which is actually very solid, but a 686 OPS. But despite that OPS, Kevin Newman blew away my expectations this past season. And I don't know if he blew away your guys' expectations, but I thought he was really solid for the D-backs this season. And he was surprisingly a bright spot for the D-backs this past season because they needed Kevin Newman at times. When Geraldo Perdomo was down and we were playing Blaze Alexander, who was hot those first couple weeks of the season, there was also a lot of mental mistakes, a lot of mental lapses with Blaze Alexander when it came to his defense, and he was struggling. And so Kevin Newman had to get a little bit more playing time, and he was actually really important to the D-backs start to the season because of the injuries and the poor defense by a Blaze Alexander. And at one point, Kevin Newman was hot and on fire for this team because he started slow those first 15 games of the year. And that's probably what created his numbers for most of the season because in May, he had a 312 average. In June, he had a 356 average. Even in July, 286, August, 265, and September, October, 292. Every month outside of August, he had at least a 715 OPS, even as high as 775 in June. Like pretty much after April, he was like a 90 hitter with like a 720 OPS. Like he was really, really solid after the first month of the season. So when we're talking about the strengths and weaknesses of Kevin Newman from this past year, I want to start with the strengths because the first strength I didn't realize he had was he was a fast ball killer, man. He destroyed fastballs this past season for the D-backs. 325 average and a 435 slugging against a fastball for Kevin Newman. That's where he did all or most of his damage for Arizona this past season. And it's not something I expected for a guy who was a little bit older, who was a guy who not had a ton of power. I didn't expect him to be overall a good fastball killer. I also didn't expect his defense. Well, I expected his defense to be solid, but I didn't expect the D-backs to need his defense as much as they relied and leaned on it because of the Perdomo injury and the Blaze Alexander struggle. And so his defense ended up being a major strength this season because the D-backs really needed Kevin Newman's defense for their team with all that was happening at their shortstop this position this past year. So Kevin Newman's defense was super important. The other thing that Kevin Newman did really well, plate discipline. This was a guy who really did not strike out a ton and really put together good plate appearances every time he went up there. He would extend innings. He wouldn't strike out easily, like only a 15% strikeout rate this past season. It was actually like one of his highest of his career, if you could believe that. Like he's only at 12% for his career. So like not striking out has always been a strength of Kevin Newman. He did again this past season. Base running was actually quietly kind of nice for Kevin Newman as well. I did not expect him to steal 8 bases this past year. He was not a speedster by any mark or anything like that, but when you steal 8 bases like that, that's actually a positive mark, and that's actually going to help the D-backs out a ton. So happy to see that and surprised to see him even be quick enough to steal 8 bases. And a lot of that's not on speed. A lot of that is on timing and just taking advantage of your situation. That's something that Newman did repeatedly. And just like Jake McCarthy, contact was something that was huge for Kevin Newman this past season. Always got his barrel to the ball. 82.7% contact percentage this past season. Maybe he doesn't have a ton of power, but he at least has a ton of contact. Because when we're talking about the weaknesses of Kevin Newman, power is probably the biggest thing. He's just not a power bat. Hard contact stats, exit velocity, hard hit percentage, all super low. Like he's just not a power guy. He's not going to hit a ton of home runs. He's not even going to hit a ton of doubles, but he's going to put together good plate appearances. He's not going to strike out. He might get a walk here or there, but when he does get the barrel to the ball and he does get it for some power, it's probably going to be in a clutch situation, maybe, or he's going to be in a big moment of a ball game potentially, because Kevin Newman, it felt like he did when he did get an extra base hit, it did feel like it came through in big moments. And so for him, I think power, the lack thereof, was definitely his biggest weakness, and just overall his ceiling as a player, just not very high, right? Like Kevin Newman, he was really good um, for what he was for the D-backs this past year, but still overall, he's still not a high ceiling player, a high ceiling baseball player. But I do think he's at least league average. When I think what a league average baseball player is, I think Kevin Newman is the definition. I don't think I want a player on my team worse than Kevin Newman. I think he is like the baseline player for what a major league baseball player is. So going forward, That's how I will judge a baseball player. If they're better than worse than Kevin Newman, he is the line, because a guy below a Kevin Newman is like a Jace Peterson. Someone like that should not be on this D-backs roster. So if you're below a Kevin Newman, you should not be on the roster. He is now the new standard going forward. And considering he's a pending free agent, what should the D-backs do with him? I think this is one where you just have to let him walk, because you got Perdomo. You have other interesting internal options with Jordan Lawler also waiting in the wings. Like, I think this could be the year where Jordan Lawler gets called up and just is the backup shortstop to Geraldo Perdomo, maybe even the platoon shortstop to Geraldo Perdomo. I don't think you need to bring Kevin Newman back again to do another bridge year at shortstop. Maybe you do it if you don't think Lawler's ready and you don't want to go that route. Then I'm not against bringing back Kevin Newman just to be another backup guy once again, because I thought he was very soft for the D-backs this past season. He already knows the organization, so it would be a pretty smooth and easy transition. But for right now, I'm feeling like it's okay if you just want to let him leave in free agency and then just do something internally with your shortstop position. That's it for this edition of the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Come back tomorrow for more Diamondbacks news coverage and insight. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy. Doses.